Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome back again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville politics, government, business, education, news, anything else that gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass, which you can find at CompassKnox.com, joined as always by Scott Barker, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. Scott, how are you doing today?
Oh, fantastic. Holiday weekend. 3 days. We'll work a couple of them a little bit, but that's just the nature of the beast. And but it's always nice to have a 3-day holiday, and we'll be observing Memorial Day on Monday, and so that'll be that's an important thing to do, I believe. So how about you? I think you've had some excitement this last week. So
yes, big personal news yesterday. My oldest son graduated from West High School. Yay!
Congratulations!
Yeah, it was fun to see. Yeah. I know you've been through this process already, but it's one of those benchmarks or milestones or whatever you want to call it that just makes you reflect a little bit on thinking about that journey from when you first see your tiny little child at the hospital all the way up through a full-grown legal adult, 18 years old now with a high school diploma. He's going to be going to Pellissippi State in the fall in their audio production program, and we have been it's interesting for me because, of course, I write about education a lot, including things like the Tennessee Promise program, for example. So I've been writing about these things for years and now am actually experiencing them, working our way through the paperwork and so forth. So, yes, all very exciting. And, of course, we are all happy for the official kickoff of summer.
Yes.
Little respite, little breathing room for everybody. Our own work at Compass typically slows down a little bit, not in the productivity sense. We continue publishing Monday through Friday. But the areas that we especially focus on, government and politics and so forth, tend to, things quiet down a little bit in the summer. We get a chance to work on some of those feature stories we've maybe been meaning to get to for months and so forth. Although, of course, in your case, since you cover the city of Knoxville, the politics side of that beat will actually start to heat up a little bit along with the temperatures here.
Oh, yes. The withdrawal deadline for the primary election passed last Thursday. No one dropped out, which is good. So right now there are 18 candidates for running for mayor, 4 council seats, 3 at-large, and the 5th district seat, which is actually going to be unopposed. Charles Thomas is going to be unopposed and is the only seat that's unopposed, and the city mayor's race. So
city judges race.
I'm sorry, city judges race
and the mayor's race too. Right?
The mayor's race too, but the city judges race. So we'll be covering that all during the summer, and we'll be talking to the candidates, delving into issues, going. I'm assuming we're going to be some forums to cover and things like that. So
maybe we should do a forum.
We could.
I got a venue for you guys if you need to borrow it.
Oh, yeah? You got a venue for us, Seth?
Well, here in a couple weeks, hopefully, when we finish all that stuff. But that's one of the things I was kind of wanting to do there anyway, on my, just like from my podcast and my personal side. I would like to see more of that happening, and, at least give, although it's a nonpartisan city race, at least give the more Republican-leaning candidates, or at least take the excuse of the League of Women Voters is too partisan for them off the table, because that tends to be who
maybe they won't come because you serve alcohol. How about that? Although I will say, I don't think I've ever been to a candidate forum at a place where you could get a drink, and so I want to go ahead and endorse this concept.
Let's do it. Yeah.
All right. Well, and we're going to have more coverage next week. I believe you're working on, Scott, a sort of full-blown look at who these candidates are who are running and so forth.
Yeah. Doing it'll be a surface, won't really be too in depth yet, but it'll be a kind of a surface thing of who the candidates are and what they're running for, why they're running, and look at maybe their campaign finance disclosures so far, that sort of thing, and kind of give people a very light taste of.
Right. This is sort of like the program for the coming election.
Yeah. I think that's.
And then you're going to come back with individual profiles of each race.
Right. We're going to be doing those. Those tend to take a while, so they'll be trickling out over the summer, and hopefully we'll have. The goal is to have all of them done by the beginning of early voting, in July. But perhaps, Sometimes, as you know, we'll bleed over 1 or 2 days into early voting.
Yeah, a lot of it depends on being able to get in touch with everybody and schedule time.
Right, and so if because these are people, they're citizens. Most of them have jobs. In fact, this city council is the first that I can recall where there weren't any retirees on it at all. Mm-hmm. Everybody's got a day job, and so they've got day jobs. They're also running for office, so they're going door to door. They're knocking on doors. They're going to speak at civic events and things like that. And so between those two things, they can be tough to schedule.
18 separate sit-down interviews.
Yeah. The odd thing is this is an election where every seat has an incumbent. Typically, there's less interest in running. From people who want to run for office. They typically will put it off till there's an open seat. Which wouldn't yet. We have term limits in the city of Knoxville, so that's every 8 years. There's going to be, for sure there's going to be an open, or pretty much for sure there's going to be an open seat. We've got 5 people running for mayor, 4 challengers to Mayor India Kincannon, the city judge race, John Rawson, the incumbent, has challengers for the first time since early in the century.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of people to talk to, a lot of folks to get to know, because a lot of these people have not run for office before. Right. So it'll be a fun learning experience for me as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, more to come on that. However, we do have some other things to talk about this week. We had some interesting. Actually, several interesting reports came out this week, and this is something that we do. We go to a lot of public meetings, of course, and pay attention to what happens there, but we also pay attention to, when we have local organizations that do various kinds of studies and data crunching and so forth, and present it to the public, we pay attention to those as well, because these can be very interesting sort of data points about what's actually going on in our community. So we have reports to talk about this week from Knox Heritage, the local historic preservation group, a report from the Knox County Health Department about some of their efforts to counter the real serious and ongoing plague of drug overdose deaths here in Knox County, a report about housing and trends in our local housing market, which of course is something that there's been a lot of discussion about lately. The downtown stadium had some news, long awaited, this week. And to start us all off, I thought we would talk a little bit about this whole discussion and confusion, controversy around the state's third grade reading law. This is the law that we have talked about here before as it's been sort of like evolving and developing over the last really more than a year, because the law was originally passed in 2021, but it only took effect for this school year. And in sort of simple terms, what the law says is that students who do not score proficient on the third grade reading or English language arts TCAP, the state standardized test that they take in third grade, that students who don't score proficient on that are at risk of being held back in third grade unless they meet sort of a set of mandatory or undergo a set of mandatory interventions. Sounds kind of simple in concept. If you don't pass this, quote unquote, pass this test, then you have to do something, summer school, tutoring, etc. However, turns out to be quite complicated in application and implementation. And we talked about this previously, some of the controversies around this law. Basically, school boards across the state, including Knox counties, begged and pleaded and argued with the legislature to please change this law this year before it really took effect, arguing that this is an inappropriate use of the TCAP. That's not what this test was designed to do. It is not a pass-fail test to advance to fourth grade. That's never how anybody has intended it or used it in the past. B, that the proficiency mark itself is widely misunderstood, including, I can say, having watched many legislative hearings on this, including by many of our legislators who continue to this day, in fact, to say that if a student doesn't score proficient on this test, it means they can't read, which is just not true. Like, that's not what it means. Most students by the end of third grade can read at some level. If you give them, a book, they can sound out words and so forth. And what the TCAP really measures is a complex and advanced level of reading comprehension, contextualization, what inferences can you make from this text. It's really about how to engage with written language at a sophisticated level. A useful thing to know, certainly, and that's what the TCAP has been doing for years, is providing sort of like an indicator of here's kind of where this student is, and depending on where they score, then there's a set of different kinds of resources or interventions that can be made available to them and so forth. But this law kind of basically treats that test more like if you don't score above this level, you're not ready to go to fourth grade. And professional educators across the state, really pushed back against this and said that's not what it means. And also, there's a lot of data showing that retention is not a very effective way of improving anybody's scores. And it also you can, what a lot of the data shows is you can get a short-term boost. Yes, if you make a kid repeat third grade, they'll probably score better at the end of the year than they did the previous year. But for one thing, those gains, there's a lot of murkiness about the data, but some of it shows that those gains don't last very long. They disappear within a few years. And that secondly, there can be a significant sort of social, emotional, psychological impacts of being held back. The sense that you're a failure, that's a heck of a thing to tell an 8 or 9 year old. All of the rest of your friends are going on to fourth grade, or in this case, where if you don't want to repeat the grade, you have to take a mandatory month-long summer camp or do year-long tutoring in fourth grade, where you're going to be pulled out of class and people will know that you're the kid who's being pulled out of class for quote-unquote extra help. That can have a real impact on how kids think of themselves, on how they think about education. There's a lot of data that kind of, once kids internalize the idea that they're dumb, that school is not for them, that it's for people smarter than them, quote unquote, that it becomes hard to engage them. And so there's the reason that our schools currently do not hold back many kids is because the widespread thinking in sort of like the professional education realm,
the people who actually do the work and understand, and yeah, exactly. The people who are doing this every day and actually working with the kids, not just looking at a set of, one score on a test, they think this isn't an effective thing to do. So the reality here is that very few kids, we won't know until we get through a couple more rounds of, the process is going on right now, but very few kids are probably actually going to be held back in third grade. But to avoid being held back in third grade, depending on where they score on the test, they're either going to have to take this month of summer classes, or they're going to have to do tutoring all year in fourth grade, or they're going to have to do both of those. The kids who score in the lowest category are going to have to do both of them. And then they still face, at the end of fourth grade, they're going to take the TCAP again, which they do. And if they don't show what the law calls adequate growth from their third grade score to their fourth grade score, then they risk being held back in fourth grade. And on top of all of that, the state has not yet actually decided or told anybody what that adequate growth score is going to mean. Like, does it mean that they have to score proficient in fourth grade? Because if so, for some kids, that's going to be a huge lift. Or does it mean something else, that they have to go up by 5%, 10%, 20%? They haven't even said that yet. And so the result of all of this, and this is something that critics of the law were basically predicting all along, is like, this is going to be a nightmare for parents of third grade students. And that's kind of what we've seen play out over the past week. Last Friday, I guess that was I forget the date of last Friday, the 19th, right? And these notices didn't even come out until the Friday evening, because the state was late getting the data back to the school system so they could do the notifications. But about 1,600 third graders, that's about a little bit more than between 35 and 40% of all the third graders in the county, received notices that they had scored below, and that they were going to have to do something. And so, first of all, they only had 2 days to decide, or I think they extended it, so 3 days to decide whether they were going to take a retest. And so a bunch of our third graders just this past week, it would normally be the last week of school where you're kind of not really doing much, and saying goodbye to your friends or having fun end of year activities, were instead suddenly thrust into this really high stakes pressurized thing of, you have to take this test again, and if you, depending on how you do on it, you might lose a month of your summer vacation. Like, that's what these 8 and 9 year olds were suddenly confronted with. So a bunch of them retook the test, but only a small number of those who retook the test actually improved enough to got over that proficient mark. And so we're still looking at about 1,400 or so kids, about 35%, or no, about 30% of the total district third grade population is going to have to do one or another or both of these interventions. But they're not even going to know that. We're recording this on Friday the 26th. That information is going to come out today. And these summer classes start basically a week from Monday. And so, families who are making whatever plans they're making for the summer or whatever still don't know, as of the time we're recording this, whether they and their kids are going to have to do the summer camp, if they're going to have to do tutoring, if they're going to get to choose, and so forth. Now, a certain amount of this is just first-year implementation of anything. The first time you do anything, of course, it can always be sort of a mess, because they're having to kind of invent systems that haven't existed before. But there's been a tremendous amount of blowback on social media and elsewhere from parents against all of this, just kind of including from a lot of parents who are saying, my kid reads great. And there was a narrative through the legislature as this bill was being discussed, and State Senator Charlene Oliver, a Democrat from Nashville, posted a video clip from April when they were discussing this law to kind of remind people, here's where the discussion about this law was about, because she was raising all these objections, saying, you're basically going to put parents and students through the ringer here for something that most educators think is not really the right way to approach this. And Senator Todd Gardenhire of Chattanooga, Republican of Chattanooga, his response to this, he dabbed his eyes with a napkin and said, I'm sorry, let me dab my eyes for these poor families. And then he just tore into these parents and basically said, if you were just reading to your kids at home, this wouldn't be a problem. Well, that's not true. And again, it goes back to
this misconception about what this test is measuring. And so you had lots of parents coming forth and saying, we read at home all the time. My kid's been reading since kindergarten, and, maybe they had a bad day. Maybe it just reflects how actually difficult this test is, and that what it's testing is not that these kids can read. So, of course, Democrats in the legislature who had opposed this law have spent the whole week, kind of saying, we told you so. We told you this was going to be a disaster. It's a disaster. Republicans have kind of been arguing it's really not that bad. State Rep Jason Zachary of Farragut put out a 4-minute video kind of talking through the whole process. Like, it's not that bad. It's not, in Knox County, only 43% of students scored proficient, but that doesn't mean that the other 57% are going to have to do this. In fact, there's a bunch of exemptions, which there are. Students with disabilities are exempt from it. English language learners who have had less than 2 years of English language instruction are exempt from it. There's some other categories there. There's an appeal that parents can file if their kid is approaching proficient rather than below proficient, which, again, that's something they don't even know yet. That's going to come out today. They can file that appeal starting Monday if their kid had scored better on another test, and they can provide that information. And I was thinking, watching Zachary explain this, like, what he was saying was basically this isn't really going to affect, quote unquote, that many kids. And that's true at a certain level, although 30% of Knox County third graders is still a lot. But the other thing I thought listening to it was, well, yes, yes, there are sort of all these different steps and exemptions, and if this, then that, and whatever, but it's incredibly complicated. The state put out a graphic kind of showing pathways to promotion for fourth grade, and it had about, 8 different arrows going lots of different directions, and that didn't even include the exemptions. Like, this is just the kids who weren't exempt from it. And so, as a parent, to try to figure out, like, is my kid going to be affected by this? What do I need to be concerned about? And so forth. There's essentially very little way to know. Some of the kids parents whose kids were affected by it came out and said, my kid is like at the top of their class in reading. They've got a 95 average in ELA. How does this make any sense that they're now being made to feel like they have failed in some way, even though all the indicators they've been getting have been the opposite? And I think that it'll be interesting to see, what the results of this are going forward, what the data shows in terms of, do the kids who go to summer camp make big improvements? Do the kids who get the tutoring make big improvements? But the other thing I think we're likely to see is that the universe of kids who are impacted by this, they may look for less convoluted ways to limit that number. And one thing that some people pointed out was that the state of Mississippi, which was one of the models Tennessee looked at in doing this, they heard yes, and I know I saw the
okay. I'm about to, at the risk of interrupting your thought.
Yeah.
In what realm of possibilities is Tennessee modeling anything to do with education off the state of Mississippi?
Right. Yes.
No offense to my friends from Mississippi. I've visited Mississippi. I've enjoyed the times I've been to Mississippi. But when it comes to education, there's the old joke that, thank God for Mississippi, because they're the only state that's consistently below Tennessee in achievements.
And to Tennessee's credit, there's more like nine or 10 states that are below us these days,
and Mississippi is still one of them.
Mississippi is always one of them. And so I think the reason they looked at Mississippi was because Mississippi did put in a somewhat similar requirement for third grade advancement to fourth grade, and because they have so many challenges, because their scores are often so low, that's the reason. That's like, well, if Mississippi, I think the thing it was sort of like, if Mississippi can show gains from this, then kind of like anybody can, and that it could be good. But that Mississippi program sets its bar much lower. Actually only affects about the lowest 10% of students. Now, there's still debate about what that data even shows. The data on all of this is basically there are about 19 or 20 states that have some kind of third grade, if you don't hit this mark, then you have to do X, Y, Z kinds of interventions. but most of them affect a much smaller student population, which is what education professionals who testified about this in the legislature said, was that you're misinterpreting what the proficiency standard means, and that if you want to look at the kids most in need of direct interventions, you need to look at a much smaller group that has very real serious challenges that probably needs. And the other thing is that teachers, principals, administrators, they all support the interventions themselves, the existence of summer camps, the existence of tutoring, which the state is providing resources to pay for these things. They appreciate those. They say that's good. It's good to have these available for the students who need them, for the families that want them, for the kids who teachers and principals and parents agree, yes, this kid needs extra help. That the problem with the way the law was written and is being implemented is just that it's based on some misconceptions about what the test means and what the proficiency standard means, and that it's affecting way more people than it really needs to, which I think is what legislators are hearing. They've done something that, intentionally or not, has affected or potentially affected, or at least thrown into a tizzy, a large segment of the population. And politically, that's not something that politicians usually like to do, is do something that makes a whole bunch of people mad at them. And so I don't know, but I won't be surprised if there's further discussion going into the second year of this law about, well, how do we somewhat minimize the impact and the maybe needless, like if it's really not going to affect all of these kids, then maybe don't panic them and their parents during the last week of school. Find a way to avoid doing that on the front end instead of having to come out on the back end and say, well, there's a bunch of exemptions if you do this and this and this, and you can retest and you can file an appeal and whatever. Like maybe there's a more structured way to do this so that it doesn't lead to the kind of blowback that they're getting.
Well, one thing about the blowback too is many of the bills that the Republican supermajorities passed in some areas have been they don't they're more partisan, and so they can discount the opposition because they don't deal with them very often, directly with them. They're not trying to kowtow to them. And, think back to the drag bill, was, the Republican supermajority probably just, people who don't like the drag bill wouldn't vote for us anyway. So we're not we are in the supermajority. We're winning elections. And so we don't need to worry about it. This measure affects it does not respect the partisan leanings of the parents of these children,
right?
And so I am sure that a lot of the legislators are getting blowback, not from necessarily people who are are Democrats who are mad about their kid. They're getting blowback from Republicans who vote for them and their kids who are, going to either be held back or go through the tutoring next year and those sorts of things. And it's a very different dynamic when that happens. I mean, these are people who put yard signs up in their yards. They're people who write checks to your campaigns. They're people who actually go to vote. And if they're displeased, then it always makes them a little more worried. So the blowback is probably, and I have no data to back this up or anything, but my guess is the data is bipartisan and loud.
Yeah, I think that is true. That's something that Knox County School Board Chair Christy Christie said when I talked to her this week, is that she said that the reaction that she's hearing and that she thinks the legislators are probably hearing too is very bipartisan or nonpartisan.
Yeah.
Because, there's not a question on the test that says, oh, also, who did your mommy and daddy vote for last year? And I'm not recommending they add that, by the way. But no, that's a good point you make, that when you are passing laws that have potentially negative impacts or impacts that are perceived as negative by minorities, whether those are racial minorities, LGBTQ minorities, or just like the minorities of people who live in the big cities of the state. It's easier for the supermajority politicians to say, right, well, these aren't my people who are getting mad. But in this case, it is their people, or it's everybody's people, kind of, who are getting mad. And so I imagine there will be continued discussion about this, but it has been interesting to watch because it is one of these things where you could see it coming. Lots of people said this is going to be kind of a nightmare. If you really do this the way it's written, it's going to affect a whole lot of people. It's going to make a whole lot of people mad. And that then is what happened. It's kind of, you can see the train coming down the track and the car on the tracks. You're like, well, if somebody doesn't move that car, it's going to be a wreck. And that's sort of where we are.
Quick interruption. Are they gonna give the breakdown by school or by region of schools? Or
I hope
like
so.
That?
I have actually asked for that information, and it's not available yet. But hopefully, because I think it would be very interesting to see. You would expect. Because students from lower income households and communities,
Region 5, or like they were talking about last week,
right? They tend to score lower on standardized tests. So you would expect there to be more impact in schools with higher percentages of lower income students. That's kind of how most academic data looks. However, because of the exemptions that are in this bill, because you have students with learning disabilities, English language learners who are also heavily concentrated in those lower income schools, a lot of them are going to be exempt from it. And so it will be interesting to see like which schools actually had sort of the highest percentages. I think you would expect to still see there to be some association there. But every school is going to have some kids who are struggling. And also, as I said, a lot of the kids who at least got hit with that initial notification were not obviously struggling. Their parents were shocked. They're like, as far as I know, my kid's a great reader. They read all the time. They've got A's and so forth. And so even though we may see some concentration in some of your lower income areas, I think you're also going to see a good number of kids in your more affluent areas.
Yeah, well, one thing is if you want to use, low income areas as a proxy for, students who will not do as well, and there's some evidence, as you said, that would lend that to be a reasonable assumption to make. Every school in Knox County has low income students. I remember, and I don't know what the numbers are now. You may, because you cover the school system. I looked a couple of years ago. 10% of the students at Farragut High School, of course, this is high school, not elementary school, but Farragut High School qualified for free or reduced lunches. Mm-hmm. And Farragut is one of the most affluent areas of Knox County.
Yep.
And so one thing that is in some of the more rural areas of the county, East and North Knox County, there's some challenges there too.
Sure.
And so it is something that affects, every school and every area of not only Knox County, but the state of Tennessee.
Yep. Well,
with the possible exception of Williamson County, but.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it would be interesting to see all of. I would love to see the data on a county by county basis and on a school by school basis. Mm-hmm. I don't know how much of that will be made available or how easy it will be to see the real impact, but we will attempt to quantify that however we can. Okay, let's talk about the stadium. What is going on with our downtown stadium?
Well, there were a few miscellaneous milestones that they passed this week. One big one is they actually went to market with the $65 million bond issue that is going to pay for the bulk of the upfront costs that will be borne by the public on this. The stadium is $114 million. Public funding will end up about 101 million of that. This is 65 million, so it's essentially 60% of the, really close to 2/3 of the public upfront funding of the stadium, and of course it's coming at a really strange time, in the bond markets, because of the threat of that the debt ceiling will not be raised. As we're speaking, they're still talking. They're still negotiating.
A deal could be announced at any point between now and when
the time this actually airs. On Friday morning, they were, the national media was reporting that they're making some progress. And where this matters, of course, is, when these bonds go out, they're going out into the greater marketplace, which a lot of people. This is uncharted territory as far as the economy goes, because the United States has never defaulted on its obligations. Came close, back to 2011, and but it would. Everyone agrees that there would be turmoil and chaos in the marketplaces, including the bond markets. So, I think that the Sports Authority was their bond counsel and their finance team was really wanting to get this out as soon as possible, within reason. Of course, they're paying attention to the interest rates, which have been going up as well, and so they finally pulled the trigger on this on Wednesday. That puts the closing date as probably June 7th, and that's a very important date. The what goes on essentially is they're selling all the bonds to J.P. Morgan, and then J.P. Morgan's turned around and sell them to other people. So on the 7th, that deal goes through. On the 7th is when J.P. Morgan turns around and wires $65 million to the bond trustee for the Sports Authority. So and then, of course, one of the issues is the X date, the date that the United States could start going into actual default is June 1st. So depending on the timing of that, if there is no deal that's reached, and what that does, there's a remote chance that could play games with the closing. But it would have to be a dramatic, automatic, complete and utter failure and of the entire worldwide financial system for that to happen.
Just locks up.
Yeah, I mean, it would just have to, and then and generally speaking, that doesn't happen in a day. I mean, it's kind of a gradual thing. I mean, the Treasury Department is looking at ways to pay some bills now and put off some later, and which might put that X date back to the middle of June, which would be after closing and that sort of thing. But basically, the that part of the financing is closed. It's going to be, that as I said, that money should be in the coffers on the 7th. So,
and we did get an actual interest rate on
we
this.
We did get an actual interest rate. These are 30-year bonds. The interest rate is 5%. That includes the underwriter's discount and all of that stuff. Which
5% is a pretty nice return on a bond. That's way more than you could have gotten for it a couple of years ago.
Yeah. Well, it's way more than you could have gotten, 8 months ago too. So yeah, it's costing it's costing the Sports Authority a lot more money, and ultimately, well, at least at first, that will mean it costs the city and the county more money. Although it's not going to cost them any more money than they'd already projected.
Right.
Right.
They had approved it up to I think about 6%.
Yeah, and
their calculations.
Yeah,
taken
that was
into account.
The maximum that they would be able to go. And one thing that's kind of interesting about that is originally it was going to be 5%. They raised it to 6%. The rate ended up coming in actually at like 5.0000001%, which, I guess technically if they'd kept the 5% limit, then weird things would have happened. So, but it's right at 5%. And one thing about that is, while it is more expensive now, and nobody's happy about that, after 10 years, they can reissue the bonds, do a new issue, refinance them, and if the interest rate 10 years from now, if things are a little bit more sane and it's down, back down to 3.5%, then hey, they can save 1.5% on financing for the remaining 20 years of the issue, and so that will be a huge substantial savings if they're able to do that. That would be 10 years into the stadium life, and things like property tax revenues and sales tax revenues that are going to help pay for the stadium will all be up, and so that things could end up being good. Of course, 3 years ago, no one was thinking that rates would be as high as they are now. So we can't, it's a fool's errand to go and predict what the market's going to be doing 10 years from now. So, but anyway, that was the biggest news that came out of the Sports Authority meeting last Tuesday. One other milestone that passes, the Major League Baseball signed off on the Smokies moving into the stadium. It was long expected, but it was an important formality because Major League Baseball decides where minor league affiliates are going to play, and the stadiums have to meet Major League Baseball standards for the stadium. And Major League Baseball has, when they restructured the relationship between Major League and Minor League Baseball a couple of years ago, they're taking a much bigger role in this because they look at their at minor league teams as places where players develop, and player development is the overriding goal. I won't say they don't care. The Chicago Cubs, don't care that if the Smokies have a winning or losing record or make the playoffs, or whatever. But the primary thing is getting the individual players
It's
prepared,
all about player development,
to be ready to move up to AAA or then up to the major leagues. That's what it's all about. So these stadiums now, the minor league stadiums, are for the team, they have eating facilities now that they didn't used to have. I mean, used to minor league players would stop at a convenience store and grab a couple of hot dogs on their way to the stadium, and that was dinner. They don't do that anymore. They pay a lot of attention to nutrition and that sort of thing. They do have audio-visual batting cages where a player's swing has to be recorded and so it can be dissected and corrections made and that sort of thing. They have to have those facilities at these stadiums. So, I mean this ballpark is going to be state of the art for the players, as well as it's promised it's going to be state of the art for the fans as well. But it has to be for the players to satisfy Major League Baseball. That approval came through. It had been expected because they had been working very closely. The Boyd Sports and Tennessee Smokies have been working very closely with Major League Baseball to make sure that the plans that they were developing met those major league standards. So it was really not in question whether they would give their approval, but and one of the things that does is now that they have the approval, the Smokies can go ahead and sign the lease to occupy the stadium, $1 million a year. So they can go ahead and do that, and that money will be going toward paying off that $65 million bond issue that we were talking about. Another issue that came up was an update on where the construction team is on using minority or disadvantaged business enterprises, which are minority, women, or veteran-owned businesses, as contractors and subcontractors on the project. The most recent figures were about 12.5% of the contracts that have been let out. The dollar value of the contracts that have been let out, which is a little bit over $9 million. About $80 million has been let out so far. That's gone to 11 firms, 7 women-owned firms, 3 Hispanic-owned firms, 1 African-American-owned firm that are working on the stadium project. That's lower than the 17% goal that they had, but it also doesn't include one big chunk, and that is there is a black-owned business that is part of the management team, and they're going to be getting money as well. That figure did include them. And that company's Elite Diversified Construction Inc. And it's up in the air about where that money, how much of that money will be counted toward the disadvantaged business enterprise total. But it's going to hover probably around 15%. They're still recruiting firms. Their consultant gave an update. For example, there was a firm that came forward that supplies fuel, and it's a minority-owned firm that does, and they've been unaware of this firm's existence. This firm came forward and said, we can do this, and so they've kind of hooked them up with some of the other subcontractors who use fuel for whatever, for their machinery and that sort of thing. So they're trying to get them to get a contract, and there are a couple of others. There's a wood product supplier, some others that once as they identify, they try to get them in the same room and talk to them and try to work out a deal where they can participate. So they're thinking that they'll get that number back up. Whether they hit the 17% goal is unknown. It won't be known. There's still about $7 million of subcontracts left to be let. So.
All right, so they're still a little bit below it, but still working.
And now that they've got all of the, they've got the financing in place, because all the other financing is in place. The grant from the state. Randy Boyd's going to donate, or not donate. He's going to loan money to the Sports Authority, and then Boyd is spending a lot out of pocket on this. He's spending at least $13 million out of pocket on the. In addition to the $20 million loan. But now that that's all in place, now that that's all moving forward, pretty soon we'll be hearing that there'll be a ribbon cutting and a groundbreaking, all that good stuff. I mean, they've already broken ground. I mean,
right. But they haven't had a.
I was over there the other day, and they're moving a lot of dirt, and they're big piles of dirt and rock and everything everywhere. But they'll have the formal golden shovel whole event where everybody's going to grab these shovels, and they'll be in their suits and dresses, and they will look up and smile at the camera, and it looks like they're actually moving dirt, but. Most of them probably won't even do that. They'll just grab the shovel, smile, the flash goes away, and then they go on and celebrate. Which is given the long and kind of twisting and turning journey that it's been to get it to this point, I don't blame them.
Yep. Well, and of course, we'll be able to watch all of that happen in real time over the next
I'll be one
couple of years.
I'll be one of the guys they're taking a photo of the dignitaries with their shovels,
right,
as they do all that. I don't know if we'll run it, but I'll be there.
Right. Okay. Well, let's talk about housing. The Knoxville Area Association of Realtors this past week released its annual State of Housing report. And of course, there's been a lot of talk in recent years about spiraling prices, both for home buyers and for renters, which has been impacted by lots of things nationally. But one of the biggest drivers here locally, which was a focus of this report, is just that Knox County continues to grow. And we saw this past week. The latest estimates came from the U.S. Census, which updates its population estimates every year, even though they only do a comprehensive census every 10 years. And it showed that Knox County added about 7,700 new residents in 2022 alone. That made us the second fastest growing county in the state in numbers. Only Rutherford County, which added 9,000 people, had more people moved into Knox County last year than moved into Davidson County, where Nashville is, then moved into Williamson County or Sumner County or the other places that we hear about. And that is exacerbating what was already a pretty tight housing supply. And we've talked about this before, but that basically coming out of the 2008 recession, which of course the housing market just totally cratered for several years, Knox County has never gotten back up to the level of home building that it was at before then. And so one of the things this report says is that we still have a deficit in the vicinity of 20 to 25,000 housing units that sort of should be there but aren't because they haven't been built. There is housing in the pipeline coming along, but at the moment it's sort of not even enough to keep up with, especially if we continue to see these kind of growth rates in the county. Mm-hmm. What's being built right now can't even accommodate that, much less put a dent in that, the kind of existing undersupply. And so this presentation was made to County Commission before their meeting last Monday by Hanson Sale, who's the Government Affairs Director for CAR, the Knoxville Area Association of Realtors. And it's always important to note that CAR, of course, has a vested interest in this. They represent realtors. Realtors want houses to sell. They need to have supply in order to meet the demand. And so institutionally and policy-wise, they're very much in favor of anything that increases the housing supply. As we know, that can be complicated by several factors, including, what kind of housing you want to build and where you want to build it. There is often a lot of resistance in local neighborhoods and so forth to new housing coming in, whether it is somebody developing, agricultural land out in the more rural areas into some big 300-house subdivision, or it's somebody in an urban area wanting to put multifamily housing, apartments or condos into, an already mostly developed area. You get resistance to both of those things. And Hanson Sale, who was making this presentation, and I think Carr in general would argue that, well, we need all of those. We need more multifamily. Multifamily is a place where you can add a whole lot of housing on a small footprint. For example, Nashville, a lot of the difference in housing growth between Nashville and Knoxville over the past 10 years can be attributed almost solely to the fact that Nashville has built a lot more multifamily housing. They've built a lot of apartments, a lot of condos. Knoxville has been building more of those, especially in and around the downtown area, but they can still be a challenge for lots of reasons. And those are also a challenge to build in other parts of the county. We saw some protests in Farragut just a year or two ago to their plan to build some new high-end rental and condo housing right in the middle of, the town. But even though these are going to be at fairly high price points, a lot of people there are just there's just this kind of automatic, we don't want apartments are bad, and so the call from Carr to our local elected representatives, and especially County Commission, who they were presenting to, was basically look for policy ways to make it easier for people to build more housing. That they argue that is the one thing that policymakers can do to try to address this issue of just spiraling prices. And it is a real challenge. And I thought that report, you can find it on the CAR website, and it's really interesting to read, and there's tons of data in it. I thought the single most interesting and sort of telling statistic was a graph they had that showed median home price in Knox County, the median listing price, I should say, in Knox County, tracked against the median listing price nationally, going back 10 years or so. And you can see that those lines rise and fall kind of in sync with each other, which is what you would expect. They're reacting to the same kinds of economic indicators and so on and so forth. But the Knox County line was reliably below the national line pretty much forever, meaning that Knox County median homes cost less than the median national home, which means that sort of in the national picture, Knox County was quote-unquote cheaper until last year, or maybe it was 2020. In the last couple of years, basically, those lines crossed, and the median home in Knox County now costs more, or is listed higher than the median home nationwide. That's a pretty big deal. And Hansen made the point that for a long time, basically as long as I've known Knoxville since the mid-90s, certainly for that long and probably longer, one of the kind of calling cards for Knoxville and Knox County to encourage people to move here, to encourage businesses to move here, has been, we're cheap. We've got a good quality of life. We're near the mountains, but also like we're a good deal. And Hansen just basically said, we can't say that anymore. We can't claim affordability. Now, sure, are we still cheaper than Nashville? Yeah. Are we still cheaper than Atlanta? Are we cheaper than New York City? Yes, of course. But if you're looking for a quote unquote cheap place to move, whether you're going to be renting or buying, we're not really that anymore.
Yeah, it was. It's funny you were talking about in the past. I remember way back in the day, I was, and I don't have firsthand knowledge of all this because I was not buying a home or selling a home at the time. But when Whittle Communications came here to expand here and build the headquarters, which is now the federal courthouse, it brought people from all over the country, a lot of people from New York, a lot of people from Chicago, and I don't have firsthand knowledge, but a word was, and I haven't gone back to look at it to confirm, but the word was that they would come in and go to places like Sequoia Hills and other, high income areas and just, throw money at people because they were selling a place wherever they were coming from that was smaller and much more expensive than a large, sprawling villa type house in Sequoia Hills or any other area of town here. So they were just coming in and saying, well, and this was before some changes were made to the law about capital gains on real estate and all that. So they were coming in and really just, what do you want for your house, and I will write the check. And that isn't necessarily the case, as you said now.
And to the extent that it is a case, it's actually one of the things that is helping to drive up these prices too, because because we are still relatively cheaper than, say, places in California or New Jersey or whatever. And so one of the things that has certainly happened, and this was kind of accelerated and exacerbated by the pandemic for various reasons, but that we are still seeing that happen where people sell a $3 million house in California and come here and buy a $2 million house or whatever. And 25% of home purchases last year were for cash. They were not people taking out mortgages. And about half, a little less than half of those, according to the report, were by investment buyers. And so, you've heard about this as a factor. A lot of places kind of driving up prices is real estate investment trusts, big national landlord type companies, going all over the country and kind of snapping up properties and just paying cash up front for them. The report said that that is a factor to some degree here, but not as big a factor as it has been a lot of other places. But what all of the rest of those purchases are exactly what you're talking about. It's people showing up with a bunch of cash from a property they sold somewhere else and just, plunking it down here. And that is one of the things that continues to drive up our own prices because, people who grew up here and live here and work here and, maybe have their own starter home they bought in Knoxville some years ago and are looking to move up to a bigger home someplace or someplace with more amenities or whatever. They're working with, Knoxville property values, whatever valuation increase they've gotten out of their own property, but they're up against people who are coming in with, these bags of money from other places. And so, and that ties back into that ongoing growth that we're seeing here, which is it is making it increasingly expensive. And there aren't obvious short-term. I mean, of course, the other thing that's happened, we were talking about interest rates on the bond issue for the stadium. Of course, mortgage rates have gone up hand in hand with that, which is also making things more expensive because, of course, what people who are not buying with cash, who are taking out a mortgage, care about is not just the purchase price of the home, but what their monthly payment is going to be. And so even if housing prices weren't going up, which they have, the fact that mortgage rates are going up functionally affects affordability for people. And so there's really a double, triple whammy going on. One thing that's doing is that's constricting the supply of homes on the market because people are not selling a house to buy another one right now. Because if you got a house with a 30-year mortgage at 3%, the prospect, even though its value has probably gone up a lot, if you sell it, you're going to have to turn around and buy something at 6%, 7%, and that makes it a lot more expensive. And so you get this sort of like lock-in effect where the normal churn that you would see in the housing market that opens up properties for other people to move into isn't happening nearly as much because people are just kind of sitting there saying, I'm going to wait a couple of years and see if those mortgage rates come down. So in a way, none of this was new information, but it contextualized the complexity of the ongoing challenge around housing affordability.
Well, a lot of times things like this, you kind of, here and there from different reporting that we've done or from other sources you might get that what's going on. It's nice to have it in one spot. Okay, this is what's going on in the housing market and in one place, and it does kind of focus you on the various issues. And they're, and these issues are manifold. I mean, they're, in this discussion today, we haven't even talked about affordable housing, which is, the housing crunch in Knox County hits at all price points. It's difficult no matter whether you are, low income or high income. It's difficult to find places that you're looking for. I mean, nobody's going to weep for the high income people who have a hard time looking for things, but it's still the challenges are still there for everyone.
And it is most exacerbated at the lower level, as you suggest. One data point in the report was that on sort of any given day, because there are so few properties available still, 2/3 of households in Knox County by income, the lower 2/3 of households in the county on any given day can only afford 1 out of 5 of the properties on the market. So that's 66% of households competing for 20% of what's available, and what's available is a small number to start with, and so then 20% of that is an even smaller number. And affordability affordability affects the entire spectrum, but it's most pronounced at the lower levels, if you can even call 2/3 of the county the lower levels. I think it's the supermajority of the county basically is affected by this.
And one thing too, and I know kind of need to move on from this pretty soon, but you were talking about the being about, I think, 20 to 25,000 units that we don't have that we would normally have. And of course, okay, well, surely we're making it up, because we are, the planning commission, county commission, city council, they're approving, new subdivisions, new apartment buildings, things like that. I'll take one, just Belltown, for example, which is the mixed-use development about the size. I always like to say about the size of Jacksboro. That's going to go in North Knox County on Emory Road, just west of Clinton Highway. And it's going to have more than 1,000 units. It's one of the largest developments that's come down the pike in years. And that's 1/25 of the, right. And they're not going to be all built out for 10 years. So it's, and
if we're adding 7,700 people a year, which is, I don't know how many households, but say about 3,000 or so, depending on size of the household. Belltown could sort of theoretically absorb a portion of 1 year's growth.
Yeah, a third of growth for 1 year would go to this massive development that's going to be going in that won't even be ready for another decade.
Yep.
So it's really it really kind of shows you the when you start looking at those kinds of numbers, it really shows the extent of the conundrum that the housing market's in.
Yep. And then doing good planning on top of all of that and figuring out how to absorb all of this without overbuilding or quote unquote becoming Nashville or all of the other things that people say they don't want to become, like that. Obviously, for policymakers, these are very complicated issues. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about another report that came out that, again, gives some context to another serious and ongoing struggle, which is our epidemic of overdose deaths.
Speaking of having data in one place, this was a nice way to look at it. When I saw this, the health department has put out a report on the deployment of Naloxone by first responders in Knox County, and they did this on behalf of the Harm Reduction Coalition. More on them later. But Naloxone, as many people know, is kind of almost like a miracle drug. Because someone who is overdosed, they're unresponsive, they're shallow breathing, they're passed out from overdosing on opioids. You give them either a nasal spray or an IV or a shot in the muscles, however you do it. You give them naloxone, and within minutes, and sometimes less than a minute, if you give them an IV, it can be less than a minute. Boom, they're awake again,
because it binds to the opioid receptors,
right?
And blocks.
Yes, you have these in your nervous system. You have these receptors that attract opioids, essentially, and the opioids find them and glom onto them, and that's what makes you high. And naloxone is a synthetic drug. It's also an opiate actually, but it's a synthetic drug that blocks that, and so it does so almost immediately. And in fact, it's so startling because people can wake up with this and be completely lucid the second they wake up from it, and
sometimes angry because
there's a cop standing over them, and the last thing that they remember was they were having quote unquote fun, getting high and minding their own business, and the next thing they wake up and there's a police officer standing over them, and
they're not high anymore.
They're not high anymore. Yeah. But because of that abrupt response, and the drug has the nickname of being the Lazarus drug. Somebody who is who appears dead is suddenly alive again, and that is is kind of the background of this course. We do have an opioid crisis. Deaths from overdoses of opioids have gone up dramatically every year, and this is one of those things where, while there's a little bit of an increase because of COVID-19, this was happening before COVID-19. The numbers were going up, and they've been continuing to go up. So this is something we can't necessarily blame on the pandemic. But there were 533 people who died of drug overdoses in Knox County in 2021.
Right, which is the highest number ever.
Highest number ever. Most recent number we have, 2022, is probably higher. But this has gone up, and then this study takes a look at how naloxone has been used, and by first responders only. It can be regular folks can get naloxone too, and in various circumstances. We'll get to this in a minute, but this study just looks at first responders who carry them now and deploy them routinely, and the number of people who die from overdoses in Knox County is 1.5 per day. It's usually 1 or 2 a day will die of a drug overdose. First responders administer naloxone on average 6 times a day. So it's 6 people who are potentially saved. Now, if of those 6 people, if say 1/3 of them would have died, on the way to the hospital, or once they got to a hospital, whatever, or without going to the hospital, that nobody called anybody. Let's say 1/3 of them died. That would have more than doubled the number of deaths from drug overdoses. So naloxone is this drug that is a real life-saving drug, and so this looked at this, and they had a lot of statistics on who, and this shows where where the opioid crisis really hits, and who's affected, and all in this of all of the scourges of our society. This actually is one of the few that is predominant, that doesn't disproportionately affect African Americans and other minorities. Almost 80% of the naloxone goes to white residents, most of them white males. They're between the ages of 25 and 40. And so that's kind of, and the demographics are interesting. Most of these cases, they're highly concentrated in the city of Knoxville. Although there are, you can look at a map. The report has a map of where naloxone has been deployed throughout Knox County over the years, and it's everywhere. I mean, every corner from Hardin Valley to Farragut to Tipton Station to Coreyton and Gibbs. So I mean, it's all over the place. But the vast majority is within the city of Knoxville, and it's mostly in South Knoxville and Greater North Knoxville, which was really interesting. And they go by zip code, and the zip codes that run basically from Amherst to Easttown Mall and up to Fountain City. That's where the vast majority of naloxone deployments have been. So
that's where we live,
and that is where we live. Yes, and there's a good concentration among the homeless population as well. But it's certainly not limited to the homeless population.
I got to say, like, just walking around my neighborhood, I live in Oakwood Lincoln Park. those little orange caps that come at the end of syringes. I mean, that's just become a normal part of the landscape. You just see those in the curb or whatever.
Yeah. You see them, and then you know that there are people around you who are your neighbors who are doing this, and and it's one of those things that really cuts across socioeconomic barriers. I mean, there are a lot of people who, some of these drugs cost a lot of money, and either you've got it or you're going to turn to crime to get it. So it's and one of the one of the things that's driving this increase, of course, is the advent of fentanyl, which is a hugely powerful synthetic opioid. It's 50 times more powerful than heroin, which everybody thinks of. I mean, my generation, you think of heroin and that's the worst thing you can ever take. It'll if you're not careful, it would kill you, and I'm never going to take it because of that. Well, now people are taking fentanyl and mixing it in with heroin and cocaine and methamphetamine, and sometimes lacing joints with it and things like that. And so a lot of people are taking fentanyl without realizing they're taking fentanyl. They think they're getting cocaine, or they're buying some heroin from somebody, which is bad enough. Don't get me wrong, but with fentanyl put in there, the chances that you can overdose are greatly enhanced.
Right, and it makes it very hard even for experienced users who think they know what they're doing,
right, to
actually know what they're doing.
Yeah, if when you talk about experienced users, there are these folks know how much heroin they're going to inject at a time, and they know what it's going to do to them, and they after. If you've lived through, if they survived for a while doing it, then they're pretty practiced at this. But then, if they are sold heroin that has fentanyl in it and they don't know it, and they get the same amount of drug, then they're at really high risk of overdosing. And so, but universally, I talked to people at AMR. They're the ones who deployed Naloxone more than anyone else, because they are the ambulance service for the county, and they are often the first on the scene when they get a call that someone is unresponsive or it's a possible overdose, and so they do the most by far. So we talked to one person who does their training, did the same with KPD. Because while KPD does the least of the three agencies, they have the added dimension of being a law enforcement agency, and then you've got the whole illegal drug use law enforcement dynamic going on that can throw some
right. And isn't there's an allowance in state law that if you call and report an overdose to try to save somebody's life, you won't be prosecuted.
Yeah,
yourself.
It's good Samaritan law, and they made that emphasis that if you call in, and if it's about in a good faith effort to get care for someone who has overdosed, we're not going to arrest you. I mean, we don't, we're going to go in, and of course, there's going to be paraphernalia about. There's going to be, there might be, drugs. Of course, you would think that they would probably be, frantically hiding the drugs before the cops get there or whatever. But who knows what goes on? I mean, people are panicking in those situations. They've got a friend who's dying. So they don't. They may not be thinking very clearly, but at least they're thinking clearly enough to call 911 and get help. And so, there is a good Samaritan law that in those cases, the police basically say, thanks for calling us and saving your friend's life, and we'll, be good, and we might be back later, but no, so that, the goal behind that law was to encourage people to call in when someone is in distress. And it's hard to gauge how effective that's actually been. But whenever whether it's AMR or KPD or the fire department who go, the first responder on the scene, somebody's called it in. I mean, when someone overdoses, they can't call. So there's always someone who has called it in, and they can be, reasonably comfortable that they're not going to be, hauled off to jail because, it's in their house and there might be, a syringe out, which is drug paraphernalia, and, don't have to worry about it. So, one of the things is to put it in a broader context. Is I had said that this was something the health department put out on behalf of the Harm Reduction Coalition, and the Harm Reduction Coalition is made up of kind of all the usual suspects of the agencies and involved in this type of work. The city and the county, the sheriff's office and the police department, the fire department, rural metro, AMR, the McNabb Center, Cherokee Health Systems, and some other organizations that are involved. And their focus is to kind of shift the way that we respond to opioid addiction, specifically as harm reduction, which is a way of, say, not demanding treatment immediately. You meet the person who is misusing drugs where they are. If they are ready for treatment, you help them get treatment. If they're not ready for treatment, you help keep them safe until they are ready. And so naloxone is kind of a component of that. There are other things, needle exchange programs, for example, or another kind of high-profile way of doing this. Now there are naloxone test strips, and so they pass out naloxone test strips to people who...
You mean fentanyl?
I'm sorry. Yes, fentanyl. Thank you. Fentanyl test strips where you can take and test your, if you buy heroin, you can test it to see if there is fentanyl in it, and that sort of thing. And a lot of and one of the interesting things that they do is social workers will go out and they will have naloxone, not fentanyl, but they will have naloxone, and they'll put it, they've got like a backpack, and they'll stash it somewhere. This is to help the unhoused population, and they let people who are living on the streets know where this is. If they need it, they can get it, and people do. Will go in between visits from the social workers. They'll have a place where they can go and get it. If someone else who's living on the streets, a friend of theirs, or just someone they stumble across is going through an overdose, they can administer it themselves. And in fact, and this is one of those things, we say 6 people a day are receiving naloxone, and that's through official first responders. There are thousands, almost 100,000 doses that have been distributed in the last year to people in the general community, and you can get it. You can get it by a prescription if your doctor will do it. A little bit more on that in a minute too, but so that, and it's so easy to administer, especially Narcan, which is the nasal method of ingesting it. So that if you use drugs and you are with people who use drugs, you've got this, they overdose, you can get it to them immediately rather than wait until the first responders get there. Of course, one danger with this now, and this is one thing that the folks involved with the Metro Drug Coalition and AMR and KPD emphasize, it's a temporary measure. Naloxone is. It can wear off, especially if you've got a lot of opioids in your system. And so, they always try to encourage people when they come out of the overdose and they are lucid again, try to encourage them to go to the hospital. They don't have to go. I mean, you're an adult. You can make your own decisions. You're lucid. You can go. You can go or not, but they try to encourage them, because if they don't, they can lapse back into overdose once the naloxone wears off. Some, and people's reaction to going through this can differ. Some people look at it and they say, well, this is a near-death experience. I need to get some help and stop. And others don't. There are repeat visits to residences. A lot of them go to the same, and this is broken down by address. A lot of them go to the same apartment building, and you would think, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But there are some that are individual residences in the same patient, and they'll go back multiple times, because these people, while they may, one of the odd things about this is you can pop out of it when you get naloxone. You can pop out of your overdose. You don't realize you were overdosed. You were just, there's a little blackout area, but you're fine. And so, hey, I survived. Great. You can go on and do more drugs. But anyway, but getting back to harm reduction, there are a lot of people that might look at that as saying, well, you're just enabling drug addicts to keep using drugs and things like that. And one of the things that Karen Pershing, who's the head of the Metro Drug Coalition, said, we can't treat people if they're dead.
Right.
And so that's kind of the philosophy behind harm reduction is, keep people alive until they are, want to get treatment, and then provide treatment for them.
Yeah, and I do think that that's something that sort of conceptually gets confused for people thinking about opioids, because the specific issue with opioids, and especially with fentanyl, as you're talking about, there's really two things. One is the physically, psychologically addictive nature of the drug itself, which is what causes people to continue to use it. And to, if you are addicted, you get very, very ill if you don't continue to use.
Right.
You go into withdrawal. And so there's that physical addiction that you have. But that is not unique to opioids. We have other things that are physically addictive, cigarettes being the most obvious one. What makes opioids, the reason that we are seeing so many deaths from opioids is not just because it's so addictive, but because the difference between a quote-unquote safe level, where you're going to get the effect you're looking for, and a fatal level is very small. If you're addicted to cigarettes, you're not going to die because you accidentally smoked one more cigarette than you did the day before. You're going to die, you may die in the long term, but that acute threat, that's what really sets opioids apart. And so much of this is focused on dealing with that, the lethality of it, not on the addiction. Now, of course, we do have a lot of things that focus on the addiction side, but the deployment of naloxone and all of these harm reduction efforts are about exactly what you're saying and what Karen Pershing said, which is, addressing the fact that it's so easy for people to die as a result of their addiction. Yeah. Then you can try to deal with the addiction itself.
Yeah, there are no FDA standards for heroin.
Right.
Exactly. It's you get heroin, and this is something that when you talk to people who've done, hard drugs like that, it's people cut heroin to different levels. It's different levels of purity, and used to in the pre-fentanyl days, the thing you worried about was having heroin that was too pure could kill you, and so it's such a tricky thing too. I mean, one of the things that you read about and you hear about is that someone who is addicted, who goes through treatment, and they go through the withdrawals, and they're straight for a while, and then they lapse, Well, when they go back to the first time that they, let's say it's heroin, the first time they shoot up again, if they use the same dose that they used when they quit, they're going to die.
Right.
Or they're going to overdose.
Built up tolerance.
Yeah, because there's the tolerance build up and things like that. And like you said, there's no, the difference between getting high and getting dead is razor thin.
Yep.
So.
All right. Well, an ongoing struggle.
Basically. Oh yeah. I mean, this was just a report of a 5-year window into one tiny aspect of the opioid crisis here. There are other. This was one of those things that you could write a book on the current state of the opioid crisis here, this doesn't include treatment, residential treatment, outpatient treatment, mental health issues. I mean, those are all out there too, and are aspects of it. But this does show that there is an increased use of naloxone, which does it does reverse overdoses. I don't know if you can put a number on how many lives it saved, because I don't think that everyone who overdoses and they call, they would have got a number of them would have gone to a hospital and been saved there, but a number of them would have died. Mm-hmm. So it does save lives, and as the Harm Reduction Coalition points out, as Karen Pershing pointed out, they live another day and have another opportunity to go into treatment.
Right.
So whether they take advantage of it or not, you just keep going back and keep them alive until hopefully they do.
All right. Well, one other report I just wanted to hit on really quickly was this past week, Knox Heritage, our local historic preservation nonprofit advocacy group, released its annual Fragile and Fading list. Every year they highlight endangered historic properties. Several of the properties on the list were ones that have been on the list before that we are probably all familiar with. Standard Knitting Mill, the old industrial property there by Caswell Park, which of course has been abandoned for years, had a big fire last year that did a fair amount of damage. That is owned by an out-of-state investment group that has made sort of vague announcements in the past about plans for some sort of redevelopment, but there isn't really any new information about that project. And so for the moment, as Knox Heritage pointed out, it's just sitting there, continues to be certainly endangered. The historic buildings at Knoxville College, somewhat similar situation, a little bit more real activity going on there, which we've written about and reported on, the efforts to revitalize that and really turn it back into a functional educational institution. But again, in the meantime, the historic buildings at the top of the hill up there in Mechanicsville, remain endangered. The major new property or properties, they're all right next to each other, that they added to the list. It's an interesting situation. It's 3 historic African-American cemeteries in the Westview community, right off of Keith Avenue, Crestview, Longview, and the Southern Chain Cemetery. Southern Chain refers apparently to an old African-American fraternal organization, which is one of the groups that originally established some of these cemeteries. And these cemeteries were all founded between 1898 and 1922. The 3 of them together occupy about 20 acres of space, so it's a pretty good chunk. It's nice property.
Yeah,
it goes up a hill there, and at the top you get one of those nice vistas that you occasionally come across in Knoxville. You go down some street you haven't been on before, you go up a hill, and suddenly you have this wide open view all the way to the Smokies or whatever. And so there's a nice view up there. It's just kind of green space with a bunch of old headstones scattered about, but they are in sort of grave, if you will pardon the pun, grave disrepair. The challenge here and this is an unusual one in a lot of ways, they're not really owned by anybody. They were owned by private companies that ran these, which is true of many, apart from publicly owned cemeteries like veteran cemeteries and so forth. Most of our cemeteries actually are privately owned. Right. They're run as businesses, which these were.
Or they're churchyards.
Or churchyards, right. Those are the two kind of major types of them. And for, not 100 years, say 70 or 80 years, that these cemeteries were very active. They were actively maintained by private companies that owned them and operated them. And that promised generations of African-American residents of Knoxville that they would be maintained in perpetuity, which is, of course, what you're looking for, right?
Yes.
As you go to your eternal rest, you want to know somebody's going to mow the lawn.
Yeah.
But by the mid-1980s, these companies were all out of business. And, that it kind of makes sense if you think about the historic trajectory here, because the reason we have African-American cemeteries in Knoxville is because of Jim Crow laws and segregation. And there were not cemeteries that buried, that accepted both white and black residents, if that's the right word.
Yeah.
And so as we came out of segregation and so on, fewer and fewer people were using these cemeteries. People had other options, and the companies went out of business. And for basically the last 40 years, these have just been abandoned properties. The Westview Community Group, led by Alan Adcock, former city administrator, has done yeoman's work over the decades, kind of keeping them maintained as they're able to on a volunteer basis. More recently, Denzel Grant of the Turn Up Knox anti-violence initiative that we've talked about, he has been taking volunteers over there to try to clean them up. But again, we're talking about 20 acres. It's a lot of property to try to maintain on a volunteer basis. The city of Knoxville says it's happy to help out. If people want to do cleanups, they'll provide them with tools to do the cleanup. They will come by and pick up any trash or clippings or waste or whatever that is generated. But the city does not do maintenance on private property for sort of obvious reasons. There's a lot of private property in the city that could use some more
they come mow my grass anytime they want.
Right. The city will come by and tell you that you need to do maintenance in order to meet codes. But again, that only works if you have a property owner to give that notice to, and there functionally is not, if you go on KGIS, the online property information system for the county and city, you can look at these properties and it will say that they are still owned by these cemetery companies, but those companies don't exist. They're not there. And so it's a real challenge. And I talked to, in addition to talking to the Knox Heritage folks, I talked to Councilwoman Seema Singh, who represents that district. And she said she hears, a couple times a year, people will call her and say, the grass is getting long. Is there something that we can do and whatever. She has tried to connect people in neighborhood groups with some federal funding that is out there specifically for historic African-American cemeteries. But it's one of these things where everybody kind of says, yes, this is a real problem. We should do something about it. But there just is not an obvious, the city can't, or I suppose the city could condemn the properties, but then the city owns them. And the city doesn't want to own these properties because then what do they do with them? They don't have the resources to just maintain them in perpetuity. If you tried to sell them, you get into all sorts. Who wants to buy a cemetery? It is sort of nice property. But what are you can't redevelop it.
Well, one of the things about owning a cemetery and running it as a business is, like any other business, you need more customers,
right? And
so they would have to be, they would have to be in business and be talking to funeral homes and trying to and getting to know families. It's hard to do because it's such a my father was a funeral director.
That's right.
And it's a very very much a business of relationships. There are especially in cities, there are people whose families use one mortuary. They don't use anybody else. They use this one, and even though that they've got others, and then if they've got their family in this other cemetery. That's where their family is, and that's where they get buried. And if they get buried, and now, of course, more and more people are getting cremated instead of being buried. So it's it would be very difficult to just go in and start a cemetery there as a business.
Right. Yeah. To kind of invert the old joke, what do you do when people are no longer dying to get in?
Yeah, really. Yeah.
To the cemetery.
Yeah. And, it points out, one of the things is, people think, that because it's a cemetery, somebody will magically take care of it. And it doesn't happen. One of the things, weird things of, I guess, my family was, my great-great-grandfather is buried in near the Ocoee River in southeast Tennessee. And when Cherokee National Forest was established, they went and basically found all these cemeteries and got whoever was going to maintain them to maintain them. No one did this particular cemetery, a very small graveyard. And once Cherokee National Forest was in, they didn't add new cemeteries, so nobody maintained that. My dad tried to from time to time, but there were trees growing up through all the. You just be walking through the woods. It's near a campground down there, and you could just be walking through the woods, and all of a sudden there are these, a handful of tombstones. Some of them turned over, some of them barely legible, and all, and so that's a cemetery that's gone forever, essentially. And because nobody, my dad went and cleared my great-great-grandfather's grave every now and then, but I don't go back down there. I haven't been down there in years, and my father's passed away, so as far as I know, no one's taking care of that, and it's all grown up, and it's gone. So, there needs, people do have to take care of these cemeteries if you want to keep them.
Right. Takes resources, and those have to come from somewhere. So I would say, if anybody hasn't been to these cemeteries, if you go down Keith Avenue between Western Avenue and Middlebrook Pike, that stretch of it, it's interesting. You can pull up, there's sort of parking across the street because there's another active cemetery across the street, down the street. And the Crestview Cemetery is pretty accessible. You can see that. The Southern Chain Cemetery, which has been abandoned, I think the longest, is in kind of the status you're talking about. It's pretty overgrown. Like, I don't even know that you could reclaim that cemetery at this point, because it's got trees and all sorts of things. So anyway, that report is on the Knox Heritage website, and you can read all about those properties. All right, Seth, let's take a quick break, and then we will talk about next week. Looking ahead to next week, it is a holiday-shortened week because we have Memorial Day on Monday, and there are a couple of little observances going on around town, which we will include in our Monday email for our subscribers. So if you're not a subscriber yet, now's the time to do it. And then Tuesday, City Council meets, right?
City Council will meet, and it's kind of the most important meeting of the year for the City Council, because they're going to be voting second and final reading on Mayor India Kincannon's proposed $432.9 million budget for the next fiscal year. Like I said, second reading. It's been they delayed second reading in case anybody wanted to make amendments. We'll see. There's one that's a real possibility that be coming up later in the meeting. The Councilwoman Amelia Parker is proposing that the city establish an alternative response team task force. They want we'll get into what alternative response is in a moment. It'll be a pilot program. She wants $50,000 budgeted for it from the basically the city's savings, and that's just to help study for help a task force do their work studying this and to propose a pilot program that presumably would be implemented the next year. An alternative response team is a team made up of a medic of some sort, EMT or nurse or whatever, and a mental health professional. They would respond to emergency calls involving mental health crises. Several cities have these. The city of Knoxville already has a co-responder model, which pairs a police officer with a mental health professional to respond to these calls. And the philosophy behind that is you never know what you're going to run into. You might want a police officer there. The alternative response model is police officers are really trained for mental health issues and can sometimes escalate a situation unnecessarily. So, if you don't have a police officer, you don't have to worry about it. Anyway, so that proposal, there are council members who are kind of open to it, but I don't know if they're ready to start spending money to study it. One of the things that the last time they discussed this publicly came up is several council members said, well, we want to find out, get a report from the current system, the co-responder model, before we do anything else. So we'll see how that goes. But that's going to be one change. There could be others who come in with amendments to the budget and things like that. One other topic that's coming up, and it's kind of a funny thing. The codes enforcement currently has somebody who enforces the dirty lot ordinance, and we talked about overgrown lots. That's enforced through codes enforcement. That's going to change. They're going to switch that over to with council's approval to the public service department, because the public service department does things like they pick up garbage and they pick up brush and things like that. So it'd be, the thinking is it's more appropriate there. Codes enforcement is typically building codes and those kinds of things. So not just a little moving around that could be done and some changes.
I feel like, and I may be remembering this wrong, but I don't think so. When I worked at the city, I think that's how it used to be. And I think they changed it and moved it all under codes enforcement, with the thinking being, well, it's better.
It's a code.
It's a code. But maybe it's turned out that is not the most practical solution. And so this happens sometimes. Governments change something and then they change it back.
Yeah. That's things go full circle, the different philosophies and how to approach things. And if they do this, that might be fine. The next mayor might come in, and whether it's after this election or the next election, the next mayor may come in and say, you know what, overgrown lots are a really big problem. We're going to have KPD enforce that one,
Right.
And then you have that. So anyway, so those are the kind of the another kind of interesting thing that's kind of off the wall is that the city council is going to be recognizing two sports icons of Knoxville. Big John Tate, the former late heavyweight champ from Knoxville, will be recognized with by designating the corner of Lakeside Drive and Magnolia Avenue as Big John Tate Corner. So that it will be. That will be what the honorary name of that intersection is. And then Johnny Majors, the late University of Tennessee star tailback and football coach, will have a bridge named after him. The bridge that's crossing will be taking Topside Road across Alcoa Highway. When all that mess is finished up, that will be named John Majors Bridge. And so,
what was Johnny Major's record against Alabama, Scott?
it was pretty good. Yeah. I don't remember what it was, but it was good because he came to now the first couple of years. No, it wasn't very good. The UT Alabama series is pretty streaky, and I'd have to go back and look to get the exact numbers. The first few years was dominated by, Bear Bryant was still the coach at Alabama, was dominated by Alabama, but then UT turned the tide in '84, and the next few years UT won the majority of games and kind of a streak of games that they won. Then in the early '90s, turned back around, and Alabama started winning again. So it was a mixed bag. I'd have to actually, you threw me here. If I'd only known you were going to ask me that question, I would have looked it up. And of course, you didn't know I was going to bring up the Johnny Majors Bridge. So
I only asked because Scott is sitting here wearing his Bama cap as per usual.
Yeah, according to BamaHammer.com, Johnny Majors was 4-12 in his 16 years.
Against Bama?
Against Bama.
That's not as
it's BamaHammer.com, so their leaning seems pretty
clear. It could be 14-4, and they just switched them around just to fool you. That's actually I thought he did a little better actually than that, but.
Well, he's going to get a bridge. Anyway.
He's going to get a bridge anyway. I mean, he did. He was a fine coach and brought UT back to prominence. They went in the mid '70s. UT had a really good run in the late '60s. They started kind of going downhill in the mid '70s. Johnny Majors he coached a national championship team at Pittsburgh in '76, and then came here and to UT. And had a fine run and brought UT back to prominence. The typical 9-10 win seasons that UT was used to,
and aspires to again.
So we'll.
And then one other thing this coming week, there is a city open house for West Knoxville.
Yeah, this is another in a series. The city has been hosting these open houses. They've had them so far in South, East, and North Knoxville, and so this is the time for West Knoxville to shine. And what it is, it's an open house where residents can go and find out about what's going on with city projects and other issues in their area of town. When they had the one in South Knoxville, they talked about the pedestrian bridge. They talked about the one in North Knoxville. They talked about the public safety center and other issues with both of them. And the West Knoxville meeting, they'll be talking about improvements at Lakeshore Park, for example, Pleasant Ridge Road construction, neighborhood traffic calming issues, Northwest Greenway, all these topics, all these projects that are going on in West Knoxville. If you want to get an update on what's going on, what the next plans are, you can talk to them there, and there's usually a variety of things. I mean, KUB is going to be there. They'll be there to talk about the fiber network if you want to find out more about that. So it's a really good kind of resource for you to go and find out what's going on, in your community. A lot of times you don't know that they're doing road work somewhere until the road's closed, and you have to suddenly make a detour when you're late to your doctor's appointment or whatever. So, this at least can kind of give you a heads up on that. And that is at 4:30, from 4:30 to 6:30 at Bearden Middle School on Thursday of this week. So,
all right. Well, we hope you are all enjoying your long weekend, and we'll be back next week to talk about those things and more.
And thank you, Seth, at Barbarian Productions, as always.
And our theme music is by Will Wright. We'll talk to you later.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily, in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.